what's up? Welcome to the Copy Blogger Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tim. As always, I'm with Ethan. Hi, Ethan. How are you?
I'm doing good. How's it going, man?
Great. So as usual, we were having a conversation and Ethan interrupts me and he says, hey, can you record this? Because this is really, really cool. I love listening to Dan Carlin. Hardcore History, in my view, is the best podcast that's ever been created ever. There's two series three really. There's the Genghis Khan series that he did, which is brilliant. There's the Road to Armageddon, which is the World War I podcast. It's 6 episodes. Each episode is like 4 hours long. Mind blowing. It is so good. I must have heard it. I must have listened to it like 30 times. And there's another one called King of Kings, which is 3 episodes and it's all about Persia. And I love Persia. I love it because as Westerners, I think we neglect some of the more Eastern ancient empires that are just as amazing and just as beautiful as ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the shit that we learn about in school, right? So anyway, part of the King of Kings episode, towards the end of the Persian Empire, you learn about Philip II, who was Alexander the Great's father. And then you learn about Alexander the Great. I love Philip II. He is so freaking cool. He's like an old school Viking hero warrior with one eye and walks around with a limp and he's always drunk. He's super cool. And so somehow, because I listen to Hardcore History, I was recently recommended on Spotify How to Take Over the World. And I'm like, damn, this podcast is so good. There was a Philip the Great episode on How to Take Over the World. He went into a little bit more detail about how, let's call it Philip the Great's diplomacy. He was super charming. And even when he would conquer people, he didn't punish them. And he was very receptive to their culture. And I loved it. So I researched this guy. His name's Ben Wilson. Turns out Ben Wilson is the producer for My First Million. And I'm like, holy shit, how the hell did this all happen? Ben, if you're listening, I shouted him out on Twitter. I sent him a DM. I told him all about how much I love Philip the Great, Philip II. He hit me back with just oh, awesome, thanks. And I was a little bit underwhelmed by that. But regardless, Ben, you're a genius. Keep recording episodes. I really, really love it.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, so that's interesting. I don't think I realized what the direction of your path of travel into that was. And one of the reasons I said we should record this is because I started to suspect that maybe we had heard about him from different angles. So yeah, Tim asked me, he goes, have you ever listened to How to Take Over the World? And I'm like, yeah, dude, because Ben he's not technically a coworker, but he's pretty close. He is the producer for a couple of my coworkers. It's a great podcast. And then we were talking about it. We were talking about how he actually handles the episodes. And I've never met Ben, but I've heard a little bit of the behind the scenes stuff because Sam and Sean are actually investors in the pod. I think there's something there that they basically are helping him sort of take that to the next level. And so I know just a little bit about how he handles that week to week. And my impression from what I know so far is that he does all the research and then scripts the episode. Everything you're listening to, he's written out kind of in advance. And he's just got a very natural way of conveying it. And the reason I said I think we should record this is because here's my controversial take on How to Take Over the World. I think it's better than Hardcore History.
No, stop.
Dude, I know.
Come on.
Here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna be part of this conversation. Then you're gonna go back and listen to Hardcore History again. And it's gonna be like a giant window just broke. And you're gonna be like, oh my God, How to Take Over the World is better. Because that's exactly what happened to me.
Not possible.
I thought the same thing. But let me tell you why. I'll tell you why. And first of all, I have to say, huge Dan Carlin fan myself. In fact, I think he's what got me into podcasts. I don't think I listened to anything before his interview. I think he did an interview with Tim Ferriss at some point, and it was one of the first ones. And his was literally one of the first podcasts I ever listened to, and it is fantastic. It's even more impressive when you know that he doesn't necessarily script his stuff.
Yeah.
He's free flowing. So he's just this incredible storyteller who will talk for 12 hours about how Genghis Khan took over the world.
Yeah.
The thing that Ben does that's a little bit different, and the reason that I think it appeals more to me after now hearing both of them in very close proximity, is that Ben brings it home with the lesson. So he'll review the life of this incredible person, and while he's going through it, he's picking out things that he notices. And at this point, he's done the biographies of several different people, everyone from Walt Disney to Thomas Edison to like not the Vanderbilts, but another one of those like crazy rich families.
Yeah. He did one on Putin. He did one on Catherine the Great. The one on Putin was wild.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting to hear somebody, and Dan Carlin could totally do this. He just doesn't, because I think he comes at it from a different angle.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really interesting to have somebody kind of giving you not just the story, but also the commentary and like tying the habits of successful people together all at once. So I started listening to Dan early. I kind of dropped it just over time. Started listening to Ben earlier this year. And when I did, I was like, man, I got to get back into hardcore history. And I went back to hardcore history. And I'm like, it's still great. It's great. But I actually think Ben could be bigger. But so huge shout out to Ben. I'm stoked that you stumbled across that, dude. You're getting into it, huh?
Yeah, I've loved history always. Like I was truant in high school, and even the days where I skipped school, I would come just to go to history and then like leave again. It's so fun. It's the coolest thing ever. And yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is, I don't know what the word is, like something that history has that you can't get anywhere else. It's still all in your imagination because you don't have the tweets and you don't have like the cell phone videos that we expect so much, you know? And so like you're forced to come up with the real life visual of what it looked like and what it smelled like and what this person is, like all the quirks that they have or whatever. Like Caesar, I know a lot about Caesar, and I just finished the Caesar one, and he was an epileptic, and you totally forget that. And you think to yourself like, wow, what would it have been like where the most powerful person in the history of the world just randomly has a seizure in front of, you know, some of his soldiers who like worship him and admire him. And like, does he stand up from that being embarrassed, or does he just shake it off because in his head, he's like some proxy god? You know, I love that shit. I really do.
Yeah, I feel you. I never liked history when I was younger, but as I've gotten older, I have way more of an appreciation for it now. And the two things that I love about it, one, and I am constantly running into this, are the unseen connections, or the like sort of the connections between major events that you never would have drawn until you go back and you look at it. And what you realize is that, so one perfect example of this, one of my favorite books is, I think it's just called 1925. Let's see, it's Bill Bryson, and it's like One Summer in America, 1927. And the whole book just describes the summer of 1927, but it just so happens that like a whole bunch of really interesting things happened in the U.S. that year. So it was, I'm going to get it wrong now because I haven't listened in like a year or so, but it was the year that the first transatlantic flight ever took place. It was the year that like the Yankees had their winningest season ever. It was the year that there's a whole bunch of minor storylines that are also going on throughout the course of that book. And what you see is characters start to dip in and out of each other's stories, even though the stories seem unrelated. And so it's just so interesting when you have somebody who's really skilled at picking through history and showing you how things are actually connected.
Yeah, totally.
The other thing I love, and I guess not to go too far on the history thing, but I you know, I'm sure everybody listening to this probably feels similarly about it as you and I do, is, I don't know, I'm always sort of caught off guard by how different the past was and how similar it was. And like, one of my favorite examples of that is reading Wikipedia bios of like old time characters, and they sound like, on the one hand, they sound completely, you'd never hear anybody like this today. And on the other hand, a lot of them read like a different version of somebody's Twitter bio. So, you know, like the OK Corral.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. When I read his bio, it was the first time I noticed this. And then it's just come up again and again and again. But it's like, John Henry Holliday, better known as Doc Holliday, was an American gambler, gunfighter, and dentist. And it's like, who has that job description? When you dig into it too, he's like, and he was a mountain man, and he was, you know, he did this and that and the other thing. He was a lawman, all these kinds of things. I just love that there was a time in this world when somebody's life could be so varied. And I actually think we still live in an age like that, but the job descriptions sort of change. But I also laugh because I'm like, you cruise through Twitter and there's some guy who's like, founder, dog dad, like, it'd be like 20 different things, race car driver. And it's like, who are you trying to impress? Wyatt Earp is just like, if he had a Twitter account today, It would be the craziest Twitter.
Yeah, Wired Up he was the sheriff, right? Wired Up just says sheriff.
Well, hold on a second. Let me pull that up because if like he's another example.
Yeah, right. Who knows what kind of weird thing he was actually doing?
Yeah. You know how the other way I stumbled across this? Okay, so it says
the town was Tombstone, I think, right?
Yep. Wyatt Earp, American lawman and gambler. So like that's like basically saying you're a professional police officer and World Series poker player. Yeah. It's just like people don't have those job descriptions anymore, you know?
Yeah.
Then there was a guy. This is actually kind of interesting for people who don't know about this. I'm going to blank on his name. It's Buffalo something. But he's one of these guys who absolutely changed the world and nobody knows his name. He invented all the tools that were used to mechanize the ice trade way back in the 1800s.
Wow.
And a lot of people don't realize this, but like for a long time, ice was America's second largest export by weight. It was one of the things that changed the world more than anything else. Cities exist in large part now in the way that they do because of the ice trade came about.
Before ice, you had to salt everything. Is that insane to think about the fact that all meat had to be salted up until like 100 years ago?
You couldn't even, people had to live close to farms. You know, there was a whole bunch of disease and stuff that used to break out in the summers because people didn't have like
parasites.
Access to. Yeah, it was just all kinds of stuff that happened. And there's this guy who basically invented the ice industry. He lived way up north and he decided, you know, you could cut blocks of ice in the winter and then store them in straw and then move them around. They could last a long time. They could last all the way through the summer up north in your ice house. So he decided he was going to try and sell ice to people in the Caribbean. And he did this whole huge thing where he bought a boat. And even that was a whole big fiasco because ship captains didn't want to move ice anywhere. They were afraid it was going to like ruin their boats. He got attacked by pirates. He finally got a load of ice all the way down to the Caribbean and nobody knew what to do. Like they didn't know what it was. People would take it home and put it in their windowsill because they're like, oh, that's what you do with ice.
Wow.
And then they would get all pissed off at him because it would just disappear, you know, like he was a swindler. That guy ultimately ended up, I mean, it took him years to crack it, but he ended up building the ice trade. And it made him incredibly wealthy. It made America incredibly wealthy. A lot of people don't remember that. And it completely changed life in ways that people nowadays don't even appreciate anymore. I mean, like ice was one of the most important, like, tactical advantages that the North had during the Civil War. So there's a whole bunch of implications of it. But anyways, now we've gone way too far.
Now we're in it. I know. This is why I love having conversations with you, though, man. We're both like kind of just nerds that stare up at the sky and think about shit too much.
Yeah. God, now how do we pull this back on track?
You just got to go for it. We just got to rip off the Band-Aid. So
we had somebody we wanted to call out before we get into the actual meat of the show.
Absolutely. We got a 5-star review. It was probably my favorite review so far because they shouted out our theme music. And I cannot tell you how long I listened to all these different music samples to get the right theme music. So that makes me feel really special. It is from Jeff Gabinski. I hope I said that right, Jeff. Thank you so much for your review. Jeff says, love the energy and diversity of the content this podcast covers. You see, man, people appreciate the history. And also the intro music.
He's going to go delete his comment afterwards and be like, these guys got way too bold after
no one cares about ice.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Jeff, pretty interesting dude. He's got a company called Humor, which I think has got to be nominated for like one of the best URLs of all time. Humor.rocks. I think I'm spelling that, or I'm saying it right. Humor. HUEMOR. And it just so happens that something that Jeff is doing borders something that I've been working on, which is what I wanted to talk to you about before we got way into all these different rabbit holes. So I mentioned before we started recording that right before we hopped on here, I had sort of like disappeared down this research black hole, which is part of my job. And in doing so, stumbled across this sort of like fun little story about a business that I want to share with you. But it starts with a guy. I want to know if you've heard of this guy's name. Have you ever heard of Greg Packer?
Never.
Okay. Greg's one of these guys that I think everybody has technically heard of without realizing it. So Greg Packer's famous for being the very first person on earth to buy an iPhone. And that's kind of what I mean when I say you've heard of him without realizing it. It's like everybody knows what the iPhone is, and you would assume there was somebody who was the first person. So you're like, yeah, well, I guess that makes sense. And that guy was Greg Packer. But the story goes like a little bit deeper because it turns out that the reason Greg was the first person on Earth to buy an iPhone is because Greg has a hobby. And his hobby is making it to the front of the line at like major events. And the weird thing about this is that it turns out Greg Packer has been unwittingly like quoted by the press on more than 100 different occasions as a man on the street. Yeah. Can I read you something? Because this is what let me just read this I'm going to read this from his Wikipedia page. The person who noticed this apparently was a columnist in 2003. Her name was Ann Coulter or Ann Couture, and blogger Mickey Kaus. They were commenting on media coverage, and they basically, here's a quote from, I believe this was a quote from Coulter. She said, it was an essay for the Times to spell it was easy for the Times, New York Times, to spell Packer's name right because he is apparently the entire media's designated man on the street for all articles ever written. He's appeared in news stories more than 100 times as a random member of the public. Packer was quoted on his reaction to military strikes against Iraq. He was quoted at the St. Patrick's Day Parade, the Thanksgiving Day Parade, the Veterans Day Parade. He's been quoted on not one, but two New Year's Eve celebrations at Times Square. He was quoted at the opening of the new Star Wars movie, at the opening of an H&M clothing store on Fifth Ave, and at the opening of the viewing stand at Ground Zero. He's been quoted at Yankees games, Met games, Jets games, and even got tickets for the Brooklyn Cyclones. He was quoted at a Clinton fundraiser at Alec Baldwin's house in the Hamptons and the Pope's visit to Giant Stadium. And then it goes on and on to talk about this, but like, that was 2003 and that's not even all of it. Like this guy has gone on to continue to be at the front of the line in dozens and dozens and dozens of situations. And the funny thing about this to me, again, this is just sort of like one of those funny stories that you stumble across, is that nobody ever notices. So there's all these journalists out there not going out there to find this guy and be like, I want to know what Greg thinks. They just happen to find a guy on the street and quote him. And it's this guy who's been quoted hundreds of times. So I love this story, but the reason that I came across it, the kind of the business connection, is it turns out that there's an entire industry of what they call line sitters. This
is exactly what I was going to talk about, bro.
No, it's not.
I swear to God, it's so cool, isn't it?
So wait a second. This is the little thing. You're like, hey, if we have time, like I have something
Definitely.
that I found. Come on.
I swear to God, because
dude, you're going to have to fire me and get like another show host.
No, but this is perfect because I was talking to Nick Gray, right? Is this where you found her from?
Yep.
It was such a cool story. So I'm thrilled because my story for next week is going to be about Nick Gray's museum hack. He sold it and I sent him a bunch of questions. I love websites and businesses that are media oriented. I think you guys all know this about me by now, that like aren't about media, like using media to build a business that isn't about media, like selling a course about something that isn't about creating a course, Mm-hmm. And so I've got interested in museum hack and we've been going back and forth. And then anyway, he had this amazing tweet thread all about these line sitters. And so please, I read it out loud to my wife and everything. Continue. I'm pumped about this.
Okay, well, that's hilarious. I'll run through it pretty fast because it sounds like we're both on the same page here. But basically, Nick was in New York, and shout out to Nick because he wrote this up. Not only did he share a cool company, but he wrote this up in a great way. He was in New York and takes a picture of a man in line, and he says, this is Robert. He started a business in New York City with zero money. And then he goes on to talk about how Robert is a professional line sitter. And what that means is he would just stand in line for people who like want event tickets, or back then in the day, it was like these cronut things that were like one of those, food fads that get so huge. He'd charge $25 an hour. And, when you finally get to the front of the line, he would text somebody and then they could come stand in their spot in line. Robert has built an entire business around this called Same Old Line Guys, which is an awesome like website name.
So good.
And the link is somewhere in there towards the end of the thread, but go ahead and click it and check out like all the things that they do these days. There's another thing too.
Keep reading through the thread first.
Well, I actually just to recap the entire thing. So they did cronuts early on, $25 an hour. Rich people loved it. They would wait in line for hours. If you scroll all the way down, basically it turned into like a really successful business. And there was a really interesting little marketing hack he did where he would use
This was my
sidewalk
favorite
chalk.
part. This was actually the part that I wanted to talk about.
The sidewalk chalk? Why don't you tee
Yeah.
this up for people?
Well, how do you market this kind of business? For me, since I'm an SEO, I would think just rank number one for how to get somebody to wait in line for you, right? Like you could probably fill your business pretty simply for doing that. But I think the ingenuity here and just the really simple thinking about like, hey, where's the best place to market to people who are waiting in line? It's at lines, right? And so he just went around with sidewalk chalk all around New York City for different releases. There's one he talked about. There's a woman's fashion brand that was like really, really high end and had some big release. And so he just walked around New York City, with sidewalk chalk, and it said, skip any long line in NYC. Hashtag line dudes. Established 2012. And then he has another one. It was basically a piece of paper that he would just unfold and put on the sidewalk. Skip any line in NYC. Same old line dudes LLC with the phone number. We wait for your once. I mean, that's clever. I would have come up with a better piece of copy. Hashtag line dudes, right? And of course, like when you see it, it's so intuitive and the ingenuity is so clutch, but it's just another example about how stupid people like us overthink things. Where for somebody that is just out there getting after it, you know, it's like, hey, I'm going to just go to the line.
Yeah.
And that's it. I'm just going to go to the line and I'm going to make myself known at the line. And it really, really stood out to me about just like I said, the simpleness of the thinking.
Yeah. Agree. Love this marketing tactic. And it speaks to something else too, which is like, I dug into his website and it's really interesting. Here's like the types of things that they do. COVID testing lines, which that one is weird to me because I'm not sure how, I guess you could do that. That's fine. But that's
people
like
text you. They text you right when you're at the front of the line.
Yeah, it just seems like a high risk line.
Out.
It seems like a high risk line to stand in.
Totally, kind of gnarly.
Hamilton cancellation line, which I'm assuming those are like people who bought Hamilton tickets and then canceled or something like that. So there's like a new tickets available.
Makes
Broadway,
sense.
a lot of Broadway lines, sample sales, pop-ups. But what I love is their terms and conditions. So if you read their pricing page, I actually think this would be one area. It's just a straight $25 an hour. And then there's all these rules and add-ons, you know, if they're waiting during certain hours of the night or during holidays, like inclement weather below 32 degrees, extra $3 an hour, $30 max per sitter. But what's so funny about this page is like every single line is like overnight premium and then the premium. And it's like no exceptions, no exceptions, no exceptions. And it's like just over and over and over, no exceptions. And what this says to me when I'm looking at it from like a business builder standpoint is you can be picky when you're solving a problem that people really don't want to solve themselves.
Yeah.
Like,
and they take themselves seriously.
Yeah. It's like, hey, standing in line sucks. So yeah, I'm going to pay you an extra $1 an hour if it's like freezing cold outside or extra $3 an hour because there's no way I'm going to do that. Like, I don't want to go stand in line if the weather's worse. I don't want to stand in line on a good day. And I just like that they're, I don't know, just being really clear about this is what we do. If you want it, if you want this problem solved, pay us. If you don't, like, forget about it. Get out of here. There's a lot of people who want the service. So this was cool. Did you know it's like a whole global thing though? Apparently, I was looking at it in, just online, just kind of poking around. And it started a while ago. There's reports that it started like in what do they call those? Communist countries, sort of after the war, or like when, you know, a lot of countries were facing food shortages and stuff, and everybody was in bread lines or lines for different sorts of supplies and stuff. And what's kind of interesting is that in kind of more than one case, people from this world have kind of gotten a lot of attention for what they do. I think partly because it is so counterintuitive in terms of it being a business. So there was this guy, a Polish guy. I'm not going to be able to pronounce his name. Tadeusz Zak, maybe? Apparently, okay, so it says right here on Wikipedia, it says, he said that his profession requires certain personal traits: honesty, credibility, activity, persistence, perseverance. Once stood in line for 40 hours, which is incredible. His specialization is lines in hospitals for registration to high demand and rare specialists. So like, that's so interesting to me. But here's the thing. In 2013, he lost his 13-year-old business that was doing this because of all the technology that was rolling out that allowed people to like pre-register and stuff like that. But it says, fortunately, Polish newspapers made, it just says Pan Tadek, which I'm assuming is him. They made him a celebrity, started receiving various offers, some unrelated to his, they're using quotes, business. For example, a role in Marionette, which is an opera. And I guess he's a dwarf. So he like fit the description for this one particular character. In 2014, he even accepted an invitation from the Democratic Left Alliance to stand for city council in his home city. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting that these things exist. You know, I think everyone's focused on building the next Facebook, and there's just so many more options out there.
Oh my gosh, totally. I'm so glad that you finished with that last sentence. It reminds me, I think about this a lot when I think about automation, and I think about people being afraid that there's not going to be any jobs. And I'm not here to make anybody's fears go away. I think about all of the jobs that are created out of automation and out of, what's the best way to put it? Out of our needs being met. Like once your needs are met, then what else is there? You're going to pay for convenience and you're going to pay for creative work. Like who would have thought even 20 years ago that SEO would be a thing?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And now there's going to be ways to market the Dolly thing that we talk about. There's going to be other stuff with blockchain and NFT. There's going to be a gazillion convenience type businesses that you can start right now. And I get really optimistic about this stuff. And I also get a little bit pessimistic because sometimes I feel like I'm the crazy one where I just look around all the time and all I see is like opportunity. Like there's so much fucking opportunity because people are willing to pay for convenience more than they've ever been before. And look, you're telling me, you remember when we were little and you had to go to the mall at like 4:30 in the morning to stand in line for Metallica. Like I remember standing in line in the freezing cold for Metallica because I grew up in Philly, right? And there's an old stadium called the Vet. There's a veteran stadium. There's a piece of shit stadium. They imploded it. And Metallica was the last event that was ever going to be played there. And the first event at the new stadium, it's called the Link, was a Manchester United FC Barcelona game. And so stood in line at fucking like 4:30 in the morning, woke up at like 2:30 because it was all the way in Plymouth meeting and I had to drive out there. And it was terrible. I was out there for like 4.5 hours, but like I got to that Metallica concert, you know, and it was amazing. So people are willing to do it. And obviously we're talking about more than just sitting in line. You know, I'm talking about all the different avenues of opportunity that exist all around you. You know, like sometimes I think about how cool would it be to have like a taco stand on the corner of the 5 Points in East Nashville. There's got to be 10,000 people that walk by that taco stand every single day. And I struggle a little bit with so many stories of, it's not that people aren't struggling. Like I empathize with that, but I think there's a lot more opportunity out there than people are giving the world credit for. And this is just a perfect example of like, hey, I'm going to stand in line for $50 an hour. And he sold his business. I'm sure he's a millionaire now.
Well, I think it's very much a way of seeing. And that comes from the people that you surround yourself with, which can be tricky for, you know, anybody who finds himself in a situation where they're not surrounded by people who are looking for opportunity. So I definitely empathize with that. I think podcasts and like all the whole creator economy makes this so much more accessible these days than it ever was before. But once you kind of drop into that, and I certainly got that when I think I've always had it. I got lucky to be exposed to like that entrepreneurial way of thinking early on. Specifically my dad I have a lot of business owners in my family, but my dad was very into these like books on tape. And so we would listen to books on tape. Like whenever he just threw me in the car and started, you know, going anywhere, there was always a book on tape playing. And so you start to hear these people and you're exposed to these ideas early. But that, if you don't have that, I don't think it is like some kind of, like sentence to failure, right? Like you can develop it as soon as you realize that you need it, you can go out and start developing it, whether it's through podcasts or like online communities, stuff like that. And I think there have been a few turning points in my life where I've suddenly been like gifted with more exposure to that way of thinking. And like for me, my current job now, just joining that community at Trends was the same way. Cause all of a sudden you see people everywhere. You see people who are building companies and they're just making it look easy. And I think that's what Nick did a great job of in this thread. And this is actually, so we mentioned Jeff a minute ago. I'm kind of cruising through his Twitter page, and his company did this interesting thing where he said, did you know the average website has a lifespan of 2 years and 4 months? We observed that. Yeah, they observed the top 100 websites in the Inc. 5000 to determine the life expectancy of websites by industry. Well, that's pretty interesting. And it kind of relates to something that I like to do with the Inc. 5000. So the Inc. 5000 just came out. I think it was yesterday or the day before. And every single year, one of the things that I like to do, we do like a whole breakdown of it. So we'll slice and dice the data and try and get like a big picture.
Trends, you mean?
Yeah. But one of the things that I like to do personally is just cruise literally through the entire list from top to bottom. And I do this over several days, maybe even several weeks, just when I have spare time. And you just start looking for companies that are growing like crazy, because that's what the Inc. 5000 is. It's the fastest growing companies that are like that you never would have guessed exist. Yeah. And you mentioned Nick. I mean, funny enough, I think he sold Museum Hack, didn't he?
Yeah, he did.
So Museum Hack is now rolled underneath a company called, hold on a second. I only know this because I literally just added them to the list. I think it's called Corporate Training or Team Building. Yeah, it's called Team Building. If you just go to literally talk about great URLs. If you just go to teambuilding.com, that's the company. Yeah. Yes. They kind of rolled up the Museum Hack, but they also have all these other really interesting team building, event driven experience type companies. Like they do one that I think it's just called Guacamole. Let's see. What's it called? Guacamole Hack, Guacamole Night, something like that. And they do just guacamole making competitions for your team at work or something like that. So it's really interesting. Well, they just made the Inc. 5000. So there's all these companies on there. If you start cruising through the data that I don't think you ever would have expected to be opportunities. And there are lots of places to find it, but one really, really accessible one is just to go to the Inc. 5000 and start looking and like ignore the top 10 results or the top, the top result this year was BlockFi, which I don't think anybody would be super surprised to hear. But you dig deep into that list and you start coming up with stuff like last year, there was a company that their entire job was to source and hire Santa actors for malls. And like pretty seasonal, but they were growing like crazy. And by the way, for people who don't know how the Inc. 5000 works, it's not just random. Your company has to have existed for at least 3 years. You have to submit, revenue, like your revenue, what do they call that? P&L, across that time so that they can judge how much money you made at the beginning, how much you made at the end, and how fast your revenue is growing. And then thousands and thousands of companies apply to this, and then Inc. selects the top 5,000 based on, percentage of growth. So it's not just like a random list. Yes, you do kind of pay to play because there's people who don't sign up for it.
Yeah,
that
totally.
Are growing faster, but it's all verified data. So if somebody says, "Hey, I run a Santa hiring company and we made the Inc. 5000," like they're outcompeting a significant number of businesses.
I love where this podcast ended up. I really do. I think it's important for people to know. I worry sometimes that people see other people that are kind of doing the same thing on repeat and mimicking them because they think it's working for them. I guess that's just what I have to do. When from like a probability standpoint, you're much more likely to find success in something that nobody's doing. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a paradox because there is something where it's like you want there to be a little bit of competition just to know that there's a market, but you also want to like invent your own market if you can.
Could we, maybe we say it slightly different. Like this is how I think I would say it. Is it you're much more likely to find success doing something other people are doing, but doing it in a new way. That's like remarkable.
Doing it in a different way. Totally. Yeah, it's like Purple Cow. Like I always think of Purple Cow when I hear this. If you drive down the street and you drive past a ranch and it's just the best cattle you've ever seen in your life. And they've been given the award for the past 100 years. Or like, this is the best cattle that's ever been made. But one of them's purple. Like, which one do you think you're going to make a remark about? You don't give a shit that they're the best cattle. You give a shit that one of them's purple. So it's like, how can you just be a little bit different? And you know what? I'll give you another example. This site isn't live yet. It's going to be. I don't know if I have to disclose this. Well, probably not. I was offered a partnership in it. It's a guy who is creating a business in Manhattan and is calling it Instaplum. And the idea is that in Manhattan, since everybody lives on top of each other, when pipes burst, the urgency of these pipes bursting. When I say pipes, I mean like in-home water pipes, whether it's an in-line or an outline. But when pipes burst, they don't just screw up that person's life; they screw up the people below them, and then the landlords can get sued because if there's property damage, then it's the landlord's fault. And so he knows Manhattan much better than I do. He presented me with some interesting data. We'll see how accurate it is. Like, I don't know if this is going to work or not. This is an idea that he just brought to me. I just think it's a good example of what we're talking about. And so he's creating a very, very high-end brokerage service that only serves emergency plumbing cases where they need it fixed right now in the middle of the night. Because what happens in the middle of the night, I don't know if you might be able to see. I mean, it's happened to me. You can probably see the scene right up there. I didn't change my air filters. When you don't change your air filter on a central air unit, what happens is the coils on your air conditioner freeze. And then in the morning, when it gets warmer, they thaw out. And then all of the thaw basically flooded through my ceiling. And so instantly when he said that, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, that has happened to me. And it's when there's water coming through your ceiling, it's just the most important thing in your life right then. Mm-hmm. So again, we'll see if it works, but it's not just a plumbing service. It's Instaplum. It's on-demand plumbing for people that need their pipes fixed right now. And he's like, look, I'm going to charge $1,000 a thing. And if you want to get your pipes fixed right now, you got to charge me $1,000. And if not, then call a plumber. Yeah, no exceptions.
No exceptions.
So I think it's really smart. And he's a smart businessman. I think he's going to succeed. Point is, it's just another example of how there's like opportunities everywhere. You just have to be different.
Speaking of being different, there's this article I think we left people kind of hanging with last week, all about the dangers of audience capture and the risks that quote unquote influencers or creators face in terms of like building an audience. I thought it could be interesting to touch on this for just a couple of minutes. I know we're coming up on time here, but I don't think the point needs to be belabored. But let me give you did you end up reading this after I shared it with you last week?
No.
Okay. So this article by
Gurwinder.
Yeah. He's a really great writer. The basic idea here is it's a case study of a few different thought leaders who basically ran into a problem, as many thought leaders do, when they became successful. So these are people who started off believing one thing and then experimenting with different types of content. And as they experimented, they started to get more and more feedback from their community and get more and more popular, more and more likes. And gradually, not only their content, but like their persona shifted to be this new type of person that is not only sort of diametrically opposed to who they used to be, but is sort of like suffering for it or is just more extreme and not in a good way. So the first one you mentioned was this guy, Nicocado Avocado, who I think his real name is Nicholas Perry. And he started off as sort of this healthy vegan guy who used to do videos about food. And then sort of like over time, he started just testing different formats until eventually he found that it was very popular to do these mukbang videos where you just eat huge amounts of food. And it had an incredibly negative impact on his life, but I wasn't familiar with this guy, so I don't know too much about him. Anyways, the big story is, as a creator, you need to be careful and very purposeful when building an audience to make sure that you end up building the audience that you want for the type of person that you want to be. Because if all you're doing is optimizing for these algorithms or something, there is a risk that you're going to end up stumbling into a type of content that you could continue to do, but would turn you into somebody that you don't want to be. And I thought this was such an interesting take on the situation. He basically breaks it down into 5 parts, but the overriding idea is that like we are who we are primarily because of the way we perceive people perceiving us. So like the way I think you see me is the way I'm going to start to act. And the reason this has been top of mind for me is because this is a theme that's come up here a couple of times. I'm growing my Twitter account, and I haven't quite fallen into a rhythm of like a way to do that I really love yet. Every once in a while, I'll post something that's very popular, but it's not really content that I super, super enjoy making, you know?
Yeah.
And it's not even that. You know what the really big problem is you start, like, you spend enough time in it, you start to see what's popular. And what the real resistance for me is do I want to start making that stuff? Right? Because I respect all these creators. But I don't respect them for their content. I respect them for their diligence because they continually show up. What this article allowed me to do is actually let go of the feeling of, or the need to make that stuff that you just know is going to work. You know, like I'll just call it the hype fury stuff, right? Where this AI is kind of pulling in everything that's worked so far and showing it to you. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just it's not what I wanted my contribution to be. And for a long time, I think it's easy or maybe risky to fall into the belief that it has to be that way if you want your career to go in a certain direction. And so what this article helped me do, and I wanted to talk about it with you because I think you're very thoughtful about this kind of thing too, is it helped me to let go of that need. And instead, I'm going to try and actually build the audience from the other direction, starting from like, well, who do I want to be and how do I want the content creation process to work like 2 years from now? And then start plotting the course toward that. And the only thing I've come up with so far for this is that there's this, I'm not even sure it's a quote because I don't think I could quote it accurately, but there's like this sentiment that I've always really liked, which is like, forget about being successful, just be useful, or like strive to be useful, something like that. And that is where I'm starting with this. I want the content to be useful. I don't really care if it's popular. That's where I've landed on this so far. But what are your thoughts looking at that kind of the just series of events there? What does this make you think of?
It makes me think a lot of things. As somebody who, I mean, I'm a pretty high energy person, and people tell me a lot that like I'm always in a good mood. Believe me, I've struggled a lot in my life with just feeling like shit all the time. Mm-hmm. And I have made strong correlations between the amount of time I think about what other people think of me and how I feel about myself. And this is why I have like a scheduling system so that I can do social media first thing in the morning and then never really look at it again. For whatever reason, Twitter doesn't do that to me. I'm not really sure why. I just find it a little bit more enjoyable, and I don't have that like self-comparison type thing, which I think is the basic underlying like manifestation of this explosion of perception. I guess is probably not saying that correctly, but I think you know what I mean. However, I disagree a bit because I think it's unfortunate that so many people get caught in that trap. And I don't necessarily have a good solution for that, because I do think that it's much better to put out as much stuff as possible and figure out who you are and who you're trying to serve through the act of creating. So I guess a much better way to say that is I don't think and then write. I write so that I can think. And I think it's really, really hard to figure out who you are and then create who you are. I think humans figure out who they are by creating. And so I guess after I say that, like, the problem is expectation. The problem is that you're going into the act of creating thinking that you need to get something out of it. Whereas what you get out of it is the creating itself. You know, this is that whole Protestant work ethic thing that like I've spent years and years of my life just obsessing over and thinking about. And it always brings me back to skateboarding. Like, skateboarding is just so fucking miserable. There's no such thing as skating. You fall. And then sometimes you land a trick, right? like skating is just falling over and over and over again. But there's something about the act of skating, which within itself is the reward. And so I think the trap there is like expectation. And maybe, look, I'm not perfect. I've struggled with it, especially with like appearance stuff, like my body. You know, I know I'm getting kind of personal on it. That's why I definitely stay off of Instagram. However, I also think that it's very, very difficult to figure out how you're going to be useful before you start creating. And like you have to do the creation to figure out how you're going to be useful.
So I actually agree with that. And this is why I wanted to jam on this a little bit, because I think it's the only thing that I have are sort of like unformed ideas related to this. But when you say you have to create first, I totally agree with that. And where I think this has helped, or what I think this has helped me stop doing, is creating the things that I think are going to be popular rather than the things that I like. Like when you're, okay, I don't know if everybody listening to this has spent a lot of time on Twitter, but the people who have will know exactly what I'm talking about when I say there are a few different structures to storytelling there that are maybe not guaranteed to work, but you see them repeated over and over and over again. Like probably one of the more famous ones is, hey, there's 300 million podcasts in the world, but 99% of them are junk. Here are 7 that are worth your time. And then that format is pretty much going to nail it every single time. And a lot of people do that, and you start to see like everybody's doing it. And there is a part of me, and I'm not sure if it's right or if this is like actually a loser mentality where it's like, I don't want to fucking do that. I don't want to do that because I see what they're doing. It's almost like once you've kind of gone behind the veil, you're like, oh, I see what you're doing there. This is not actually that helpful. You're just pushing for likes and followers. And yeah, the information is actually helpful, but this is just a straight up growth tactic. And I like I said, I don't actually know if that's right or wrong. That could be a sort of cop out mentality. But what I think this has helped me to do is go more towards what you're saying, which is, okay, well, let's say you really do have a list of 7 podcasts that you love. How are you going to convey that in a way that, where you feel like you're telling your story in a way that's true to you? And maybe it is that format. Maybe it is. I mean, there's a reason that format works. It's great storytelling. It's like a great hook, and it's super eye-catching. But what this whole topic has allowed me to do is just kind of let go of that idea of like, oh, I got to go do that. What's the word for it, man? It's like that Twitter influencer thing, where you just
what is the word for it?
I don't know. I mean, here's the thing. We've talked about Sahil Bloom a lot, and what a lot of people don't realize because they haven't taken the time to go back and really deconstruct how all these people sort of rose is that he's one of the only people who is still innovating when it comes to these types of tweet threads. And a lot of those formats that you see out there that are repeated over and over and over again.
Yeah, people copy from him.
Yeah, he starts them. So for him, I think something that's very true to him is this concept of experimentation. And I just, for me, needed the nudge of this to be to get back into that rather than doing what I thought I was quote unquote supposed to do.
Yeah.
And there's another quote that this came from Nassim Taleb all the time. I think he said it was one of the Stoics used to prefer to be asked why he didn't have a statue rather than why he did. And I think there's something there for creators these days. Cause right now, it's one of the biggest priorities for people is just building as big of an audience as possible. And if we're being honest with ourselves, I think a lot of people who do this, who do it for a living, look around and they're not that impressed with the level of talent that's out there sharing some of these ideas. It's almost like the algorithm has become too hackable to the point where it's just too easy to get a seat at the table now. For people who are listening to this, I think the point that I'm trying to drive at here is, at least this is what I'm taking away from it. Be yourself. Yeah. And continue to experiment, because doing the other thing, doing the stuff that is going to be popular, it actually carries legitimate risks. And that's what this whole audience, what do they call it? I keep wanting to say audience entrapment, which is not the right word. Audience capture thing is all about. It's not a risk-free activity to build a big following. It can actually change your life in really significant ways. So good ways, but also bad ways. So make sure you're doing it in a way where you're actually going to want what the outcome is.
Yeah. I think that was really well said, man. Truthfully, I guess wrapping up this topic, which was my favorite part of this conversation, by the way, is I like to speak with my own experience. I'm careful to give advice. I just like to speak about my experience. This is why I will always write my long form articles, because I know who I'm talking to. And I know at the end of the day, people can say whatever they want about their own success, but they can't fucking say that like I'm a hack. And that makes me feel good. Maybe that doesn't matter to other people. It matters to me. It matters, like, I know that my work matters. And so that's why I respect my work enough to do it the way that I think is the most, is the best representation of the ideas I'm trying to share with the world. And so I think that's like one possible solution. And I also think, I really, really do think this, that in the world we live in, where everybody's expected to have something important to say, you have to give yourself a little bit of grace. Because the only way that Sahil was able to get to that point where he's like the trendsetter is, I bet you if you go back 5 years on his timeline, it's bad. You know,
Yeah,
like I bet he was learning
2020.
from other people just the same. So give yourself some permission to like mimic and experiment and figure it out. My first blog posts were bad, just rip-offs. But I found my own voice, you know, so I think that's important too. But man, what a great topic. Seriously. Like, we should talk about this more often. We should talk about how to differentiate yourself a little bit in a world that's like wanting you so badly to be like everybody else.
Yeah. This is another thing related to it too. So if you look at the reason why people do this, a lot of the reason that content is created the way it's created these days is because it works for the algorithms that drive visibility. And what I was thinking the other day is like, what an unfortunate loss it would be for human civilization if this entire 10 years, like all the information that just comes out of this age, is just optimized for some fucking algorithm, you know? Like and I'm not saying this is happening because I live in a pretty small bubble of like the world.
Yeah.
But again, the reason I highlighted is because I think there might be people who are listening to this who are stopping themselves from even doing the experimentation part, because either they look at the content that's out there and they don't relate with it. They don't feel like they want to do that kind of storytelling, or maybe they feel like they can't do it. Like they don't feel like they have that skill yet, whatever it is. I think my ultimate goal here is not to bag on the like large group of people who are out there hustling every single day. It's hopefully to encourage people and say, I think there's still plenty of room to do this your way. Yeah. Forget about what's popular.
There's plenty of room.
Yeah. There's plenty of room to do it your way. And you don't need like some huge audience in order to build a really successful career in this space. You really don't. So just do it your way, you know?
Love it. What a great topic. We'll rip on this again. I'm going to find something about this and bringing it to next week. Like how do you find your voice? So I'm going to look into that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as always, we went way over here, but there's other stuff that we got to talk about next week too. For everybody who hasn't seen it, Tim just wrote an article about decision making, which we were going to talk through here, but we don't have time now. So we'll have to dig into that next week. And I was telling Tim, shout out, I don't know how many podcast appearances you do outside of this, but he was just over on Jim Huffman's podcast. What is it called? If I was starting again today,
starting today, I think.
What a cool conversation you guys had.
Thank you.
So for people who are like interested in the backstory of how Tim sort of came up to the industry or like ended up here at Copyblogger, like the story with the first thing Brian ever said to you is hilarious. So funny, right? Yeah, go check that out. Go check Jim out. And I think that's all I got for today.
That's all I got, man. Thank you for your honesty, dude. I really appreciate that. Thank you to everybody who listened. Give us a 5-star review and we'll shout you out next week. Really appreciate you guys. Later.
I think before I end the recording, we're like legally obligated to say, give us an honest review of any number of stars and we'll still
I don't want an honest review. I want a 5-star review.
Yeah, give us a 5-star review. Give us a 6-star review. And Tim will pay your rent.